A single dad helping an elderly neighbor with her groceries never expected to meet the woman who would turn his quiet world upside down, a billionaire with a past she'd do anything to forget. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind had a sharpness to it that morning, the kind that cut straight through Daniel Brooks' worn flannel jacket and lingered in his bones. Snow fell in a soft, steady hush, blanketing the town of Cedar Falls in a quiet, white stillness. Most folks were still inside, heaters humming and coffee mugs steaming. But Daniel was already out, boots crunching against the icy sidewalk as he made his way toward Mrs. Plain, Delaney's modest home just down the block. She was struggling, half buried in her coat, trying to lift 2 heavy bags from the trunk of her car. The old Buick was angled slightly into the curb, its rear tires spinning gently in the slush. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Morning, Mrs. D," he said, stepping in and taking both bags without waiting to be asked. She huffed out a breath, half gratitude, half exhaustion. "Daniel Brooks, you've got the manners of a generation this world forgot." He smiled, shifting the bags to one arm so he could close her trunk. "Just doing what my mama raised me to do." "Mrs." Delaney chuckled as they walked toward the porch, the snow starting to collect on her knitted hat. "How's Sophie this week?" "Good," Daniel replied, adjusting his grip. "She's still trying to convince me she can have hot cocoa for dinner." "Smart girl." He helped her up the steps, into the warmth of her tiny kitchen, where the smell of cinnamon and old wood greeted them. He set the bags down gently and reached into the top one, starting to unload them without being asked. "Daniel, I can handle it from here," she said softly, but not convincingly. "I know you can," he replied, stacking canned soup in her cabinet. "But sometimes it's nice to let someone help." She didn't argue. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, it was warm and calm. As he loaded the last of the groceries into her fridge, Daniel caught sight of a pair of footsteps just beyond the hallway heels, clicking softly on hardwood, a shadow moving toward the kitchen. Before he could speak, a woman stepped into view, young, elegant, with dark hair pulled into a simple twist and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 miles. "This must be Daniel," she said, her voice calm and cool. "Mrs." Delaney beamed. "Daniel, meet my granddaughter Isla." Daniel wasn't sure what he'd expected, but it wasn't Isla Waverly. She stood with a stillness that felt out of place in Mrs. Delaney's cozy kitchen, her presence cutting through the room like sunlight through frost. Tall, graceful, and wrapped in a soft cream-colored coat that looked more suited for a New York boutique than the muddy sidewalks of Cedar Falls, Isla didn't smile right away. Her eyes steel blue, and observant rested on him for a moment longer than felt casual, not judgmental, but searching. "Thanks for helping my grandmother," she said, voice low and polished, like she'd practiced being polite for people she didn't trust. Daniel wiped his hands on the back of his jeans, suddenly aware of the oil under his fingernails and the worn fray at the edge of his flannel sleeve. "Wasn't anything. She shouldn't be hauling groceries in this weather." Isla nodded once. "I told her the same." Mrs. Delaney, now busy unpacking eggs with a kind of forced nonchalance, chuckled softly. "You two are going to get along just fine. Stubborn runs in the family." Daniel offered a faint smile, unsure if that was a compliment or a warning. Isla crossed to the counter and took a carton from her grandmother's hands, her movements precise and practice-like. She didn't belong in this house, but was doing her best to play the part. "I'm just here for a few days," Isla said, as if to clarify something that hadn't yet been asked. Daniel nodded, letting the silence stretch for a beat before answering. "Well, welcome to Cedar Falls. Hope it's treating you all right." Isla looked toward the frost-laced window. "It's quiet." There was something about the way she said it, not bored, not dismissive, almost like it surprised her. He studied her profile for a second elegant cheekbones, a small silver stud in one ear, hair pinned back with exactness. She looked like someone who was used to being in control of everything, except, maybe, the reason she was here. "Well," Daniel said, stepping back toward the door, "I'll let you both settle in. Let me know if you need anything else." Isla gave a small nod. Not warm, but not cold either. Just guarded. Like someone who wasn't used to letting her guard down, especially not around strangers who offered help without asking for anything in return. Sophie Brooks had always been the observant type. While most 8-year-olds might fidget through conversation or lose interest the moment adults started talking, Sophie watched. She noticed thingstones of voice, glances exchanged, the way someone's smile didn't quite reach their eyes. So when Isla Waverly stepped through Mrs. Delaney's front door that afternoon, Sophie didn't just see a pretty woman in a fancy coat, she saw someone familiar. Daniel had returned later that day to help Mrs. Plyce. Delaney with a stubborn light bulb, and Sophie had tagged along, bundled in her oversized coat and clutching a paperback she'd already read twice. As soon as they stepped into the warm house, Sophie's eyes landed on Isla, who was seated on the living room couch with a cup of tea in her hands. "Hi," Sophie said brightly. Brushing snow off her mittens, Isla looked up, surprised, then offered a small smile. "Hi there." Mrs. Delaney glanced over from the kitchen. "Sophie, this is my granddaughter, Isla. She's visiting for a bit." Sophie tilted her head, studying her closely. "I've seen you before." Isla blinked. "Oh? Have we met?" "No," Sophie said slowly, stepping forward. "But I think I've seen your picture." Daniel, crouched near the front closet, shot a glance toward his daughter. Curiosity piqued. Isla's expression flickered just slightly, barely enough for an adult to notice, but Sophie did. The tightening of her grip around the mug. The way her smile didn't deepen. "I don't think I've been in any pictures you'd know," Isla said gently. Sophie frowned, unconvinced. "Maybe it was on a magazine or something." Daniel raised an eyebrow, half amused. "You read magazines now?" Sophie shrugged. "Mrs. Langley brings them to school sometimes when we're doing collages." Isla chuckled softly, recovering. "Well, maybe I just have one of those faces." But the moment passed too quickly, and Sophie, already moving on to pet Mrs. Delaney's sleepy cat, didn't push. Still, the thought sat in the back of her mind, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She didn't know who Isla Waverly was not yet. But she knew without a doubt that she was someone important, and Sophie Brooks never forgot a face. Dinner wasn't planned, it just sort of happened. Daniel had come by to fix the rattling ceiling fan in Mrs. Delaney's living room, and by the time he was done, the sun was dipping low and the snow outside had thickened into a soft, steady fall. Sophie, always one to find her way into a warm kitchen, was already helping Mrs. Delaney stir a pot of vegetable stew. Isla sat quietly at the table, a hardcover novel open in front of her, though Daniel noticed she hadn't turned a page in nearly 10 minutes. "Stay for dinner," Mrs. Delaney insisted, waving a ladle like a conductor. "You too, Isla. Lord knows it's too slick out to drive, and this stew isn't going to eat itself." Daniel hesitated, glancing toward Isla. She looked up, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something less guarded in her eyes. Not warmth exactly, but maybe permission. "That okay with you?" he asked her casually, brushing snow from his jacket sleeve. Isla closed the book gently. "Sure, I'd like that." Sophie beamed and rushed to set the table, pulling out mismatched plates and silverware without being asked. They sat together, the four of them, at Mrs. Delaney's small round table under the dim glow of an old kitchen lamp. The stew was simple, hearty, peppery, and exactly what a winter evening called for. Daniel watched Isla between bites. She had good manners, that much was clear. Please and thank you, elbows off the table, napkin neatly folded in her lap. But it wasn't just politeness, it was habit, the kind that came from years of formal dinners and high expectations. And yet, she laughed gently, sincerely when Sophie recounted a story about dropping her lunch tray at school and pretending it was an artistic performance. There was something about the way Isla listened. She wasn't faking it, not here, not now. Her shoulders had relaxed. Her laugh didn't sound rehearsed. And when Daniel refilled her water glass, she looked up and said quietly, "Thank you. It was such a small thing." But in that one moment, he saw past the polished shell and glimpsed something else. Someone who, maybe was just tired of pretending. And Daniel, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, wanted to know more. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickers of amber light across the living room walls. Mrs. Delaney had retired early, claiming she was too full from dinner and needed to rest her eyes, though Daniel suspected it was her gentle way of giving space. Sophie had curled up in the corner with a coloring book, humming quietly to herself, while Daniel helped Isla clear the dishes. The kitchen now empty, Isla moved into the living room, absently straightening a throw pillow on the couch before settling in the armchair nearest the fireplace. Daniel followed with 2 mugs of teach-em-a-meal, Mrs. Delaney's go-to, and handed one to Isla. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer in the quiet. He sat across from her, watching the way she stared into the flames like they held answers. The room felt still, like something unspoken hovered just above them. Then, as Isla reached to set her mug down on the mantel, the cuff of her sleeve pulled back slightly. That's when Daniel saw it. The watch. It wasn't flashy, no diamonds, no oversized logo, but it was unmistakably expensive, sleek, understated, and painfully out of place. A brushed gold case, deep blue face, and a woven leather band stitched with a precision that only came from one of those high-end European brands. Daniel wasn't an expert in fashion, but he recognized craftsmanship. That watch alone probably cost more than most of his clients' entire cars. He said nothing at first, but something shifted in him. Isla caught his glance and followed it to her wrist. "Oh," she said, casually tugging her sleeve back down. "It was a gift." Daniel nodded slowly. "Nice one." She gave a small, guarded smile. "Yeah? One of the few I kept." The way she said it stuck with him, not boastful, not flippant, just detached. Like the watch, and whatever came with it, didn't belong here. Maybe didn't belong to her, either. Sophie looked up from her coloring book. "Is it a special watch?" Isla blinked, then smiled gently. "Not really." But Daniel wasn't so sure. He'd fixed cars his whole life, and he knew a finely tuned machine when he saw one. Isla Waverly was built to run in another world, and she was doing everything she could to hide it. By Monday morning, the whispers had already begun. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where news traveled faster than the snowplows. One woman, in an unfamiliar coat, could spark a dozen conversations, and Isla Waverly, poised, polished, and clearly not from around here, had become the latest fascination. Daniel heard it first at the hardware store. He was picking up a new socket wrench when Doug Carter leaned over the counter and nodded toward him with a knowing grin. "So," he said, drawing the word out like he was easing into a good story, "you meet the movie star yet?" Daniel raised a brow. "Come again?" Doug chuckled. "Heard Mrs. Delaney's got company. Young woman, real classy type. Someone said she was wearing heels in a snowstorm." "Sounds impractical," Daniel said dryly, but his stomach tightened. Doug laughed. "Yeah, well, they say she's some kind of executive or big city investor. You'd know better than me, you've been around there lately, haven't you?" Daniel gave a non-committal shrug, grabbed his receipt, and ducked out. By the time he stopped by the diner for coffee, the story had grown legs. Janice behind the counter was full of questions, half of them disguised as small talk. Was she married? Was she writing a book? Did she come from money? Daniel deflected as best he could, but it was clear. The town was curious. And curiosity in Cedar Falls didn't fat it, just got nosier. Isla, for her part, seemed to sense it too. That afternoon, when Daniel dropped off a few supplies, Mrs. Delaney had requested, Isla met him at the door. Her posture was straighter, her smile more practiced than it had been during dinner. She looked like she'd slipped back into a version of herself she didn't want to wear. "They're talking," she said, not accusing, just matter of fact. He nodded. "It's a small town. They talk when someone paints their fence a new color." Isla leaned against the doorframe. "Feels like more than that." Daniel met her eyes. "They don't mean harm, just curious." She looked past him toward the snowy street. "Curiosity's never harmless. Not when you've spent your life being watched." Daniel didn't press, but her words lingered. In a town full of warmth and welcome, Isla stood like a shadow on the edge of it, wanting in, but not sure how to cross the threshold without losing herself. The bell above the garage door chimed just past noon. Cutting through the familiar drone of machinery and the clatter of tools, Daniel looked up from beneath the hood of a rusted-out Ford, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped into the front of the shop. She stood just inside the doorway, Isla wearing a long charcoal coat and boots dusted with slush, holding a small paper bag in both hands. Her expression was measured, but not cold. Cautious, maybe. Like someone walking across unfamiliar ground, not sure if it would hold. "Hey," she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow, pleasantly surprised. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I figured," she replied, then held up the bag. "These are for Sophie. Mrs. Delaney and I baked yesterday. Thought she might like some." Daniel nodded, motioning her toward the counter. "She'll be thrilled. She's got a sweet tooth and zero self-control." Isla cracked a smile as she set the bag down, glancing around the shop. It smelled of motor oil and winter air, the floor scattered with bolts and tire dust, the kind of place that was always halfway clean, halfway chaos. "You work on everything yourself?" she asked, fingers brushing the counter's edge. "Mostly. Got a part-time kid from the high school who helps out when he's not buried in homework." She nodded slowly. "It's honest work." Daniel leaned against the bench, arms crossed. "You say that like you're surprised." "I'm not," she said. Then, after a beat, "I envy it, actually." That caught him off guard. "What, grease-stained hands and busted alternators?" She tilted her head. "No, the clarity. Things either work or they don't. There's no politics in a broken engine." Daniel studied her for a moment. "Lot of politics in your world?" Her eyes flicked to the floor. "You could say that." The air settled between them, not uncomfortable but thick with things neither of them quite knew how to say yet. Daniel reached into the bag and pulled out a cookie, then held it up in mock inspection. "Well, if you're trying to bribe Sophie, this is a good start." Isla laughed, and this time, it wasn't measured. It was real. And for the first time since she'd stepped into Cedar Falls, she looked a little less like someone on the run and a little more like someone who might want to stay. The car was waiting for him when he stepped outside the next morning, sleek, low to the ground, and gleaming like it hadn't seen a dirt road in its life. It sat awkwardly in the gravel lot behind the garage, out of place among the rusted pickups and aging sedans that usually lined the fence. Daniel circled it once, hands in his jacket pockets. The badge on the hood subtle, stylized marked it as a Ravenholtz 90, a precision-built machine that cost more than most houses in Cedar Falls. He'd only ever seen one before, years ago, in a car magazine someone left in the shop. "Rental," she'd said. He crouched near the front tire and let out a slow breath, pretending not to think too much. The engine had a misfire simple enough, maybe a faulty coil or sensor butt. The car itself whispered a different kind of story. You didn't rent a Ravenholt in a town like this. You inherited it. You were born into it, or you were running from it. The hood clicked open beneath his hands. He popped it and leaned in, the scent of clean metal and high-end parts rising up to meet him. Everything under the surface was too clean, too perfect, like it had been serviced by white-gloved technicians in temperature-controlled garages. "Something wrong?" He glanced up. Isla stood a few feet away, wrapped in a wool coat, arms crossed against the cold. "Nope," Daniel said. "Just a car. Fancy one." She nodded once. "I told you it was a rental." "You did." He turned back to the engine, keeping his tone even. "You always rent Ravenholtz?" There was a pause, and then the soft sound of her boots on gravel as she stepped closer. "I guess I wasn't thinking how it might look. I didn't plan to be here this long." Daniel tightened a bolt, then looked up at her. "You planning on leaving soon?" Isla didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the distant line of trees at the edge of town. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm tired of going places that never feel like home." Daniel didn't press her, but something in his chest shifted. He looked back down at the engine and kept working, but the questions didn't stop. Not about the car. Not about the woman who drove it. The garage was quiet that afternoon, save for the ticking of a cooling engine and the faint buzz of Sophie humming from the office as she colored. Daniel sat at his desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, his phone face down beside him. He'd fought the itch all morning, but curiosity had a way of lingering, especially when someone like Isla Waverly walked into your life and handed you a mystery on 4 wheels. He opened the browser, typed slowly, Isla Waverly. For a moment, nothing. Then the page loaded and the truth hit harder than he expected. There she was. In digital ink, headline after headline. Waverly heiress vanishes from public eye. Isla Waverly steps down, from PR role at Waverly Motors amid family scandal. From boardrooms to backroads. Where is Isla Waverly now? Daniel leaned back in his chair, breath caught halfway in his throat. The photo at the top of one article showed her at some charity gala, same eyes, same sharp jawline, hair swept into a neat bun, and surrounded by a sea of suits and gowns. She didn't look like the woman who had stood in his garage 2 days ago holding cookies in a paper bag. But it was her, no doubt, Waverly Motors. One of the biggest luxury car companies in the world. The same name etched onto the engine block of that Ravenholt. Daniel exhaled slowly. Damn. He clicked through the articles, each more invasive than the last stories about her father's rumored power struggles, stockholder disputes, press scandals involving the board. Some praised her for being a calming face of the brand. Others accused her of walking away when things got hard. None of it told him who she really was, but it did tell him this Isla hadn't just left a job. She'd left an empire. Dad? Sophie's voice piped up from the doorway. Can we get hot cocoa after work? He turned, startled, then nodded. Yeah, we can. As she disappeared back into the office, Daniel stared once more at the screen. At Isla's name, her photo, her world. Then he closed the tab, leaned forward, and rubbed his hands together, trying to ground himself. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't just a life of luxury. It was everything that came with it. The sky was turning lavender when Daniel pulled into Mrs. Delaney's driveway, headlights slicing through the evening mist. The cold had settled in early, and a thin sheen of frost already glazed the porch railings. He didn't have a reason to stop by, no chores left, no errands owed, but something gnawed at him, too quiet to ignore. He found Isla out back, standing near the garden bed where summer tomatoes had once grown. She wore a thick sweater under her coat, hands tucked into her pockets, hair pulled back in a loose knot. She didn't turn when he stepped off the porch. I Googled you, he said simply. She flinched, but didn't pretend to be surprised. Her shoulders rose with a quiet breath. Of course you did. Daniel walked a little closer, stopping a few feet behind her. Why didn't you tell me who you were? She turned then, slowly. No pretense, no charm. Just tired eyes and the hollow kind of honesty that came after holding something too long. Because I wanted to be someone else, she said. Just for a little while. Daniel studied her face, the quiet tension around her mouth, the flicker of shame in her eyes. You're not just someone with a nice watch and a rental car. You're Isla Waverly, as in Waverly Motors. She gave a small, humorless laugh. Yeah, that name doesn't get you many real conversations. He crossed his arms, but his voice stayed calm. You running from your family, or the mess they made? Both, she answered without hesitation. After my father's health declined, it became about control. The board wanted a figurehead, and I was the easiest target. I smiled on stage, gave polished speeches, and inside I was drowning. She looked down, then back up at him. I'm not here to impress anyone, Daniel. I'm here because I didn't know where else to go. Cedar Falls was just a pin on a map. He nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch between them. You could have told me. I know, she said, her voice quiet, but I didn't want you to look at me the way everyone else does. Daniel's gaze softened. And how's that? Like a headline, she whispered. Not a person. There was nothing flashy in the moment, no dramatic music, no sweeping revelations. Just two people standing in the cold, trying to bridge a truth. "I'm not going to tell anyone," he said. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she looked like she believed him. They sat on the back porch in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward but heavy with unspoken things. The cold bit at their cheeks, but neither seemed in a hurry to go back inside. A single porch light cast a warm glow between them, and the scent of wood smoke drifted from a nearby chimney. Isla cradled a mug of tea in both hands, steam curling up into the night air. Daniel didn't press her. He just waited, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the frost-covered grass beyond the fence. Finally, Isla spoke. "My father built Waverly Motors from the ground up," she said. "Started in a garage smaller than your shop. He was a visionary. And for a while, everything he touched turned to gold." Daniel looked over. She wasn't looking at him, just staring straight ahead, like she was seeing it all unfold in front of her again. But when he got sick, things changed, fast. The boards swooped in like vultures. People I grew up calling uncle and aunt started whispering about stock prices and succession plans. Her voice turned brittle. They needed someone to put in front of cameras. Someone with the right name, the right smile. So, I became their cleanup act. Daniel said nothing, but his gaze didn't waver. "I was good at it for a while," she went on. "Played the part. Said all the right things. Smiled until my face ached. But the more I tried to keep things together, the more I lost any sense of who I was." She paused, her breath visible in the cold. "One night, I looked in the mirror and realized I hadn't made a real decision in months. I was just reacting, being who they needed me to be, and I hated it." She turned to him, finally. "So I left, took the car, picked a place on the map, and just drove. I didn't know anything about Cedar Falls. I just needed quiet. Somewhere I could breathe." Daniel nodded slowly. "And now?" "I'm still trying to remember what real feels like," she whispered. He didn't have a perfect answer, but he offered something better: his presence, steady and unflinching. Sometimes, listening without judgment was the closest thing to grace a person could give. And for Isla Waverly, it might have been the first honest moment she'd had in a very long time. The next few days unfolded quietly, wrapped in snow and the gentle rhythms of small-town life. Isla didn't try to fill the silence anymore. She let herself move slowly measured steps through the market, a second cup of coffee in the morning, sitting beside Sophie while she drew little animals with crayon-sure hands and serious concentration. Daniel never made a big deal of her presence. That, more than anything, made her stay. He treated her like anyone else. Not like a secret, not like a burden, and definitely not like a headline. He talked to her about spark plugs and brake pads, offered her a stool at the edge of the shop while he worked, even handed her a wrench once just to see if she'd take it. She did, and she dropped it 10 seconds later, laughing at herself. He didn't laugh at her, just smiled and showed her how to hold it properly. On Saturday, Sophie invited Isla to help make pancakes. Daniel stood back and let them take over the kitchen, though he kept a watchful eye when Sophie nearly dumped an entire bottle of vanilla into the mix. Isla had flour in her hair and syrup on her sleeve by the end of it, and she couldn't remember the last time her face had hurt from smiling. It was simple, uncomplicated, real. Later that night, as Sophie dozed off with her head on Isla's lap and an old cartoon flickering on the TV, Daniel leaned against the doorway with a quiet look on his face. "She likes you," he said. Isla brushed a lock of hair from Sophie's forehead. "I like her, too." Daniel gave a small nod. "This town's slow, maybe even boring by some standards, but it's honest." She looked up at him, eyes soft. "That's exactly why it matters." He didn't ask her what she meant. He didn't need to, because he could see it happening already in the way Isla moved more gently, spoke more easily, laughed without catching herself. She was shedding something, or maybe remembering something. The life she thought she'd outgrown was quietly showing her what she'd been missing all along. The snow had thickened by evening, falling in quiet sheets outside the windows, muting the world beyond. Inside Mrs. Delaney's living room, the glow of the fireplace bathed the walls in amber light. Isla sat cross-legged on the carpet, her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, listening to the creak of old photo albums being stacked on the coffee table. Mrs. Delaney settled into her armchair with a small, satisfied sigh. A fleece blanket draped over her legs. "Figured it was time to bring these out," she said. "Been too long since anyone looked through them." Isla glanced up, curious. "Family albums?" Mrs. Delaney smiled. "The old days. You were always in the middle of everything: mud pies, lemonade stands, falling asleep on the swing set." Isla gave a small laugh, unsure whether to feel nostalgic or embarrassed. "I barely remember." "Then it's a good thing I remember for you." The first photo was simple. A sun, drenched backyard. Isla no older than 4, hands in the air, face sticky with what might have been jam. Her father stood behind her, laughing, his hair still dark, his shirt untucked. He looked young, unburdened. Isla stared for a long moment. "He used to laugh like that?" she asked softly. Mrs. Delaney nodded. "All the time, before everything got so big." Page after page, they moved through the years. Birthday parties with homemade cakes, snow forts, lazy afternoons in the garden. Isla as a child, wide-eyed and fearless, always barefoot. Her mother smiling beside her, arms around her waist. Summer picnics, paper crowns. Nothing about it looked expensive, and nothing about it looked staged. "I forgot we used to be like this," Isla murmured. "Back when it wasn't about markets and stockholders and press releases." "It was never supposed to be," Mrs. Delaney said gently. "That all came later. After your father built his empire, he started forgetting what he built it for." Isla traced one photo with her fingertip herself in a tree, legs swinging, mouth open mid-laugh. She hadn't seen that version of herself in years. And maybe that's why she was really here. Not just to hide from the world, but to remember who she used to be before it all changed. Before the name Waverly became more weight than warmth, the scent of kettle corn and wood smoke drifted through the crisp evening air, mingling with the sound of laughter and distant music. Strings of warm yellow lights stretched between trees and booths, casting a golden hue over the snow-packed square at the heart of Cedar Falls. The winter fair had returned, as it did every year, modest, charming, and stitched together by 100 pairs of mittened hands. Daniel watched Isla from a few steps behind as she took it all in her breath, curling in the cold, her eyes catching on every small wonder. She wore a simple wool coat, her hair tucked under a gray knit beanie that Sophie had practically begged her to wear. It didn't scream Waverly Motors, it didn't scream anything, really. And that's what made it perfect. No one recognized her, no one asked about her family, her past, her name. She was just another person holding a styrofoam cup of cider, laughing softly at Sophie's wide-eyed excitement over snowflake-shaped cookies. They wandered through the stalls together, admiring handmade ornaments, trying samples of maple fudge, watching couples wobble their way around the pop-up ice rink. Isla's cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her smile was steady. "Real." "You ever go to fairs like this back home?" Daniel asked, handing her a caramel apple. "Not like this," Isla said, accepting it with both hands. "Our events had valet parking and coat checks. They never smelled like cinnamon." Daniel grinned. "Well, that's a shame." Sophie tugged at Isla's hand just then. "Come on. You have to see the snow maze before it melts." Isla followed without hesitation, boots crunching over snow as the two disappeared into a maze of packed white walls. Daniel watched from a distance, smiling to himself as he listened to their laughter echo back through the night. When they finally returned, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. Isla looked at him like she was surprised by her own happiness. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how easy it is to forget everything else when you're just here." Daniel didn't need to ask what she meant. He could see it in her eyes, the way the weight she carried had shifted, if only for a night. For once, Isla Waverly wasn't running. She was just a woman at a winter fair, holding a child's mittened hand and remembering what it felt like to belong. The fair had wound down to a gentle hum, most of the crowds drifting home, arms full of leftover sweets and scarves pulled tight against the cold. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky now, soft and slow, as if even the weather had decided to pause for a while. Daniel walked beside Isla along the tree-lined path back to Mrs. A. Delaney's, the sound of their boots muffled by the snow. Sophie had conked out in the back seat of the truck 20 minutes ago, curled up under a blanket with powdered sugar still dusting her cheek. She hadn't even made it past the parking lot. They'd offered to walk instead, saying they needed the air. That much, at least, had been true. The silence between them was comfortable, their shoulders brushing lightly every now and then. Daniel glanced sideways at Isla. Her hat had slipped back, a few strands of hair falling loose around her face. She looked younger tonight, lighter. Like a version of herself, she was still learning how to carry. "You looked happy back there," he said softly. Isla turned to him, snow catching on her lashes. "I was." She said it like a confession, like happiness, was something borrowed, something she didn't quite trust would stay. They stopped near the edge of the Waverly porch, light from the living room spilling out through the frosted windows. Everything around them was quiet, the town tucked into its nightly slumber. Daniel took a half-step closer, and for a moment Isla didn't move away. Her breath fogged the space between them, her eyes locked on his. "I'm not trying to make anything complicated," he said, voice low, steady. "But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her eyes said enough. He leaned in, slow, giving her every chance to pull away. When his lips brushed hers, it was tentative, gentle, searching, honest. The kind of kiss that didn't ask for more than the truth of that moment. And for just a heartbeat, she kissed him back. Then she pulled away. Her hands came up between them, not forceful, just enough to put space where none had been. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice barely audible. Daniel searched her face, but she was already retreating into herself, into the fear. She shook her head, a breath catching. "I can't afford to need anything right now." He nodded, stepping back, giving her the distance she didn't know how to ask for. But even as she turned and slipped inside, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the moment had meant something, maybe too much. It started with a shadow. A black SUV parked across from the garage just before noon, windows tinted, engine running. Daniel noticed it, but didn't think much of it. People got lost in Cedar Falls all the time. It wasn't until the third time he caught the same vehicle cruising slowly past the corner of Maple and Oak that something unsettled stirred in his gut. The photo hit the internet the next morning. He found out when Sophie's teacher called. Not because Sophie had done anything wrong, but because someone from a national gossip site had reached out to the school. "Requesting comment," they said, on a child. Daniel barely finished the call before the garage phone rang again. This time, a reporter with a too-smooth voice, asking about your connection to Isla Waverly, the heiress currently hiding out in your town. He hung up without answering, but the damage was already done. The image was everywhere. Daniel and Isla standing at the town fair, closer head tilted up toward him, snow drifting between them like a scene from a movie. The headline was a punch to the gut. Waverly heiress romantically linked to small town mechanic, a scandal in flannel. The phone wouldn't stop ringing after that. Not at the garage, not at home. People showed up, first reporters, then strangers with phones held up like shields, filming everything from across the street. Sophie's quiet routine was shattered. She clung to Daniel's leg at the grocery store when a camera followed them down the bread aisle, and she vanished. Not physically, she was still at Mrs. Delaney's, but she didn't come by the garage, didn't stop by for coffee or cookies or small talk. Her silence was sharp, her absence even sharper. Daniel stood behind the counter at the shop, staring at the cracked screen of his phone where the photo still hovered, dozens of comments flooding below. His life had been quiet, honest, predictable. And now, all of this business, his daughter, the fragile peace he'd built, was a headline. Not because of anything he'd done, but because of who she was, and what she'd been trying so hard to leave behind. By midweek, The garage no longer felt like Daniel's. Reporters had learned the rhythm of the town when the school let out, when the lunch rush died down, when Daniel usually opened up shop. They hovered at the edges of his property like birds of prey. Cameras raised the second he stepped outside. Some shouted questions. Others just stared through zoom lenses like they were waiting for something to crack. It wasn't just them anymore either. Strangers had started showing up, people who wanted autographs, photos, drama. A few even tried to schedule fake appointments, just to get inside the building. One man asked if Sophie was really his daughter. That was the only time Daniel came close to losing it. He installed a "No Media" sign on the fence and shut the front gate during work hours. Business dropped by nearly half in 3 days. Some folks just didn't want the attention. Others were afraid of being photographed while getting their mufflers replaced. Sophie was quieter now. She clutched her backpack tighter at drop-off, kept her head down when they walked anywhere in public. She didn't say much about the cameras, but her eyes said everything. She was afraid, not of Isla, of what had come with her. When Isla finally appeared at the edge of the garage lot, Daniel was in the middle of locking up early. She looked thinner somehow, her coat wrapped tighter, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. "I'm sorry," she said, before he even turned to face her. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, slow and quiet. "It's not your fault the world won't leave you alone." Her jaw tightened. "It is. I thought I could disappear here, blend in. But I brought everything I was trying to escape into your life, into Sophie's." "She's scared," he said plainly. "I won't lie to you." That cut deeper than he meant it to. Isla looked down at her boots, her breath fogging in the cold. "I didn't come here to hurt anyone," she whispered. "Especially not you." "I know," Daniel said, "but it's hurting anyway." The wind moved between them, cold and restless. For the first time since she'd arrived, Isla looked like she didn't know what to do next, and Daniel didn't either. The morning she left was quiet. No snowfall, no reporters, just a dull gray sky pressing low over Cedar Falls like the town was holding its breath. Isla stood by the back porch, a single duffel bag at her feet, her hair tied back in the same simple twist she'd worn the first day they met. She looked composed, controlled, but Daniel knew better. He saw it in the way her hands kept fidgeting in her coat pockets, in the tight set of her jaw when she glanced toward the road. "I called a driver," she said, not meeting his eyes. "He'll take me to the airport in the city. I'll be gone before lunch." Daniel leaned against the railing, arms crossed, heart sitting heavy in his chest. "You don't have to go." She looked up, and for a moment her guard dropped. "I think I do." Sophie wasn't there. She was at school, tucked safely in a classroom far from cameras and headlines. That was part of Isla's plan. No drawn-out goodbyes, no confusion, just a clean break for Sophie's sake. "They won't leave you alone while I'm here," she said. "And they won't stop until they have something to chew on." I thought maybe I could hide, but that was naive. Daniel sighed. "You weren't hiding. You were trying to live." "Same thing sometimes," she replied softly. He stepped closer, close enough to see the shimmer of tears she refused to shed. "You think leaving will fix this?" "No," she admitted. "But maybe it'll stop it from getting worse." There was nothing dramatic in her voice, just resignation. Like someone who knew how the story always went and was finally ready to stop pretending it would end differently. Daniel wanted to say something, anything, that she mattered, that she didn't have to carry this weight alone. But he saw it. She'd already made up her mind. Not because she didn't care, because she did. She picked up her bag, pausing as she passed him. "Thank you," she said, voice thick, "for letting me remember what normal feels like." And then she walked down the steps, toward the waiting car, without looking back. Daniel stayed on the porch long after the taillights disappeared, the silence around him louder than it had ever been. The gravel crunched beneath Isla's boots as she walked to the waiting car, the sound sharp in the cold morning air. She moved with purpose, but her steps weren't hurried. There was no panic in her departure, only the aching finality of a choice made long before the car ever arrived. Daniel stood a few paces from the porch, hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his coat, watching her like he might wake up if he blinked too long. The wind lifted strands of her hair as she turned at the door, her eyes meeting his for what felt like the last time. Neither of them moved right away. Words felt too big, too dangerous. One wrong syllable might break what little peace they were pretending to hold. "I meant it, you know," she said quietly. "This place, it gave me more than I expected." Daniel nodded, jaw tight. "You gave us something too." She offered a smile, small, soft, sad. "I don't think Sophie will understand why I'm gone." "She will," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the way his chest burned. "She's smart. She'll figure out it wasn't because you didn't care." Isla looked down, her voice thin. "That's the hardest part. I care more than I should." There it was, the truth between them, raw and unvarnished. Love had crept in when neither of them was ready. It had grown between laughter in the kitchen, quiet glances over coffee, and the sound of Sophie's giggle echoing through the hallways. And now, it was being left behind like a suitcase, too heavy to carry. Daniel took a step forward, close enough that he could have reached for her. He didn't. Instead, he asked, "Will you be okay?" She hesitated. "I don't know." The driver opened the car door, the mechanical click slicing through the air like a blade. "Goodbye, Daniel." "Take care, Isla." She climbed into the back seat, the door shutting softly behind her. The car eased away, tires whispering over the road, and Daniel stood still, watching it shrink into the horizon. He didn't wave. She didn't look back. But they both felt the weight of everything that could have been and everything that never would. The smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the garage, but inside, it was colder than usual. Daniel stood at his workbench, staring down at a half-finished carburetor, tools lined up neatly beside eye, untouched. Outside, the lot was half empty, a strange and unsettling sight for a Wednesday. Usually by noon, he'd have 3 or 4 cars lined up, engines still warm, owners waiting in folding chairs with coffee in hand, and small-town gossip on their lips. Now, silence filled the gaps where laughter and routine used to live. It wasn't just the reporters, though; they still lingered at the edges of town like storm clouds. It was the way people shifted when they saw him at the hardware store, or how conversations stopped a little too quickly when he walked into the diner. Friends who'd once dropped by unannounced were suddenly busy, unavailable, unsure of what to say to the man whose face had been plastered across gossip sites next to the words, "Heiress romance scandal." He couldn't blame them. Cedar Falls was built on quiet predictability, on trust. And Daniel had, unintentionally, dragged something foreign into their comfort zone. Sophie felt it too. She didn't ask to bring her drawings to the garage anymore. She stayed close to home, quieter at dinner, her questions more careful than usual. "Are they still mad?" she'd asked the night before, staring at the mashed potatoes on her plate. "No, sweetheart," he'd said, even though he wasn't sure who they even were. He tried to keep the garage going. Kept the open sign lit, kept the heater running, kept his head down. But appointments dried up. A few longtime customers stopped returning calls. One even left a voicemail saying she'd find someone with less attention. That one hurt. Daniel found himself waking earlier each morning, hoping for normalcy, hoping for noise. But all he heard was silence, and the occasional distant click of a camera that still hadn't given up, and somewhere beneath the smoke and stillness, he felt the simplicity of his life, so carefully built, so intentionally small-starting to bend under the weight of something far too big. Isla sat cross-legged on the edge of the hotel bed, pen poised over thick, cream-colored stationery pulled from the drawer beside her. The room was sleek and quiet, high above the noise of the city, but the stillness gnawed at her. It was the kind of silence that didn't soothe it, echoed. She stared at the blank page for a long time before finally writing his name, Daniel. The words came slow at first, hesitant. Then faster, as if she couldn't hold them in anymore. "I'm sorry for how I left. I didn't say enough, or maybe I said too little because I felt too much. I was scared of what you made me feel, of what I could ruin by staying. But walking away didn't fix anything. It just made the quiet louder. She paused, her hand trembling slightly. I miss the way Sophie would lean against me when she was tired. I miss the clink of your tools, the coffee that never tasted good but always felt right. I miss who I was when I was there, someone real. She folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and set it on the desk. But she didn't write an address. She didn't even write his last name. Across town, in the back office of his near-empty garage, Daniel sat hunched over a grease-smudged notebook, his pen hovering above the page. His handwriting was messy, but the words were clear. Isla, I've been angry. Not at you, just at how fast everything changed. You showed up like a storm and left like fog. And somehow, both made everything harder to see. He scratched out the last line. Started again. I don't blame you for leaving. I blame myself for hoping you'd stay. That maybe someone like you could find something worth holding on to here. He stared at the page for a long time, then closed the notebook and tucked it into a drawer beneath a stack of unpaid invoices. Neither letter would ever be mailed. Both had been written with shaking hands and heavy hearts, fueled by the kind of truth people only share when they think no one will read it. And somewhere, across miles and silence, regret settled like dust quiet, constant and impossible to ignore. It was a Tuesday morning when the video appeared in Isla's inbox. The subject line read, "You'll want to see this." Sent from an old PR contact who hadn't emailed her in months, someone she barely remembered from her time at Waverly Motors. She almost deleted it without opening. But something about the message tugged at her. When she clicked the link, the video began with the grainy focus of a school phone camera. A banner behind the small stage read, "My Hero," hand-painted letters dangling over rows of fidgety second graders waiting for their turn. The camera steadied on a small girl with honey-brown hair, standing in front of a microphone that was slightly too tall. Sophie Brooks. Isla sat up straighter, her hand suddenly still against the edge of her coffee cup. Sophie smiled nervously, holding a piece of construction paper folded in half. She glanced down, took a deep breath, and began reading. My hero is my dad. His name is Daniel Brooks, and he fixes cars. But he doesn't just fix cars. He helps people. Even when they don't ask for help. Even when he doesn't have time. There was a pause, a glance to the teacher off camera, and then Sophie continued. My dad taught me that being strong doesn't mean being loud. It means showing up. It means making people feel safe. And he never gives up, even when things get hard. Even when people are mean or don't understand. Isla's breath caught in her throat. Sophie's voice was steady now, more certain with each word. He's my hero because he never tries to be anyone but himself. And when someone comes into your life who makes you feel braver, you don't forget them. Ever. The camera zoomed in just slightly, as Sophie gave a small, proud smile and held up a drawing a crayon sketch of her and Daniel standing in front of the garage. Between them stood a woman with a gray beanie and a bright red heart over her chest. My dad says sometimes heroes don't wear capes. I think sometimes they wear tool belts. And sometimes they just love you without needing anything back. The room around Isla blurred as tears stung her eyes. She didn't know who had filmed it. She didn't know who had sent it. But it didn't matter, because in the voice of a child, Isla heard everything she'd tried to forget. That love, when it's real, doesn't care how far you run. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. The envelope arrived on a Thursday no-return address, just Daniel's name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a single-page letter and a packet of paperwork, stamped with the logo of a foundation he didn't recognize, the Harbor Initiative. He skimmed the letter once, then again, slower. The language was formal, professional. You have been selected as a recipient of a community development grant designed to support local businesses affected by unexpected hardship. Based on nominations and a review of your service history, Brooks Auto has been awarded a grant in the amount of $25,000 to be used at your discretion for operations, repairs, and community engagement. Daniel blinked. The words didn't make sense because they weren't generous, but because they were too generous. He hadn't applied for anything, hadn't even heard of the Harbor Initiative. For the first time in weeks, he walked back into the garage with something like hope. He told Sophie they might keep the heater running full-time again, that maybe they'd bring back the weekend oil change special, that maybe things were turning around. But curiosity tugged at him like a loose thread. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Daniel sat down at the old computer in the office and started digging. The Harbor Initiative's website was polished but minimal. Vague mission statements. No founder listed. But when he pulled up the Our Team page, buried in the board of directors, he saw a familiar name. I. Waverly. No photo, no title, just a name. Daniel leaned back in his chair, breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen for a long time before finally closing the tab. She hadn't called. She hadn't written. She hadn't tried to make him understand. She just helped. Quietly, carefully, selflessly. No headlines. No signatures. Just one final favor from a woman who'd promised she didn't want to make anything worse and had somehow still found a way to leave something good behind. He rested his elbows on the desk, eyes closed. Isla hadn't just remembered him. She'd remembered who they were, who they had been, if only for a short while. And for the first time in weeks, the silence around him felt a little less hollow. The photo had been tucked in Daniel's wallet for weeks, folded once down the center, soft at the edges, worn from the way he kept pulling it out, looking at it, and putting it back again. It had been taken by a volunteer at the town fair, someone who went around snapping candid shots for the community board. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it felt like something more than a memory. It felt like proof. Isla stood in the center, bundled in that gray beanie Sophie had insisted she wear, her smile half laughing, half caught off guard. Sophie was in front of her, reaching up to hold her mittened hand. And Daniel Hay was off to the side, looking not at the camera, but at Isla. He didn't even remember doing that. But the truth was there, frozen in time. He sat at the kitchen table late that night, the house still, except for the slow tick of the clock. Sophie was asleep upstairs, her drawing of the three of them still hanging crooked on the fridge. The only light came from the lamp over the sink. Daniel slipped the photo into a simple envelope. No card. No explanation. Just the picture. And on the back, in his own uneven handwriting, he wrote 5 words. We were happy. That's still real. He stared at it for a long time, thumb brushing the ink. No return address. No plea. No expectation. Just a reminder. He mailed it the next morning before he could change his mind. Dropped it into the blue box outside the post office with hands that felt both heavy and light. She could ignore it. She could throw it away. She could never respond. But now she'd know that what they had wasn't a dream or a moment or some fragile, fleeting thing built on borrowed time. It had been real. And somewhere, under all the silence and space and unspoken words, maybe that still meant something. The Waverly Motors boardroom was colder than Isla remembered, not in temperature, but in tone. The walls were still lined with chrome-trimmed portraits of past executives, all captured mid-speech or mid-handshake, frozen in curated legacies. At the far end of the glass table, her father sat in a chair that seemed to dwarf him now, his once imposing frame shrunken by illness and years of silence. But his eyes were sharp, watchful. The room had been filled for 15 minutes, yet no one had spoken directly to her. They talked around her quarterly projections, investor unrest, reputation damage control, as if she hadn't just walked back in after disappearing from their world without so much as a statement. Until now. Miss Waverly, said Mr. Parliament. Yates, the head of public relations, his tone clipped. If we're to stabilize the company image, we need to discuss how your recent departure has affected public confidence. Let's, Isla said calmly, folding her hands in front of her. That one word made the room still. She didn't raise her voice, didn't perform. She just told the truth. She spoke about the pressure of image over integrity, about press releases written to disguise mistakes rather than correct them. About the rot at the core of the company, how they'd taught her to smile while they drowned ethics for profit, how she'd spent years becoming a person she barely recognized. Then she turned to her father. "Dad, I don't blame you for building something big, but we forgot who we were building it for. Somewhere along the way, we stopped caring about people and started caring only about control." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes stirred, but proud was enough. The room remained quiet after she finished, every executive still, uncertain. But they were listening. For once, really listening. "I'm not here to clean up anymore," she said. "If I stay, I'm changing things. Starting with how we treat our people and the communities we pretend to support." It wasn't thunderous. There was no applause, just a slow nod from her father, and a silence that finally sounded like respect. The sign for Cedar Falls came into view just as the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the snow-covered hills. Isla slowed as she passed the welcome marker, her heart thudding against her ribs in a rhythm she hadn't felt since the day she left. The town looked the same. Small, familiar, tucked into winter, like it belonged to a different time. But something in her had shifted. She wasn't arriving in a borrowed car, hiding behind a vague story and a name she refused to give. She wasn't Isla Waverly, heiress to a motor empire. She was just Isla, Mrs. Delaney's granddaughter, the woman who had once held a child's hand through a snow maze, the one who'd kissed a mechanic in the cold and ran when it mattered most. She pulled into the narrow driveway behind her grandmother's house, cut the engine, and just sat there for a moment, breathing, letting the weight settle in her chest. Would they be angry? Hurt? Would Sophie still smile when she saw Hera with that gap in time have already turned warm memories into frost? The front door opened before she reached it. Mrs. Delaney stood on the porch, hands tucked into her cardigan sleeves, her expression unreadable. Isla walked slowly up the path, heart in her throat. "You came back," her grandmother said, voice quiet. "I wasn't sure I'd be welcome," Isla replied, barely above a whisper. Mrs. Delaney stepped forward and wrapped her in a hug so firm, so familiar, Isla almost forgot to breathe. "You were always welcome," she said. "You just had to be ready to come home." When Isla stepped inside, the warmth nearly undid her. The same worn rug, the same scent of cinnamon tea and lavender soap. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't polish. It was comfort, and it was hers if she wanted it. Later, she'd walk past the garage, unsure if Daniel would look up from under the hood of a car. She didn't know if he'd smile, if he'd speak. But for now, she was here, not to escape, but to begin again. Daniel didn't see her at first. He was under the hood of a '94 Chevy with a busted water pump, sweated his temples despite the cold. The steady rhythm of work was the only thing that kept his thoughts from circling too tight. Even after everything, the silence, the photo, the grant he hadn't dared to acknowledge, hadn't expected to see her again. Then he heard her voice. "Need a hand?" He froze. Slowly, he straightened, wiping his hands on a rag before turning around. There she was. Isla stood just inside the open garage bay, coat unbuttoned, hair caught in the breeze. No makeup. No polish, just her. And for a second, he wasn't sure what to say. All the sharp things he'd rehearsed dissolved the moment their eyes met. "You're back," he said, voice low. "I'm here," she corrected. Not for a visit, not for a pause, just here. He nodded once, then stepped aside and motioned to the bench. She followed, and they sat in the quiet hum of the shop, the scent of oil and winter air around them. "I got your photo," she said. "I figured." Isla looked down at her hands, then back at him. "It wasn't just a good memory. It was the first time in years I felt like myself. No pressure, no press. Just Sophie's laughter, your terrible cider, and that quiet feeling that maybe I didn't have to keep running." Daniel studied her, every part of him cautious, but cracking. "So why'd you go?" "Because I thought loving you meant ruining your life," she said, plain and bare. "I saw what followed me, and I panicked. I left because I thought it was the only way to protect you, and Sophie." He let out a breath. "We didn't need protecting, Isla. We needed the truth." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the very photo he'd sent, edges softer now. This was the truth. I just wasn't brave enough to believe it could last. They sat for a moment in that fragile stillness. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened," she whispered. "I just want a chance to stay, as me. As the woman who fell in love with a man who made her feel like home wasn't something she had to buy." Daniel's reply was quiet, but sure. "Then, stay." And for the first time, there were no headlines, no hiding, just the honest truth. Spring came slow to Cedar Falls, peeling back winter inch by inch. The snow receded, the days grew longer, and with them came something new, tentative, but rooted. Like the way a seed dares to push through half-frozen ground, unsure if the sun will stay. Daniel and Isla didn't dive headfirst back into anything. There were no dramatic declarations, no hurried promises. What they built now was quieter, stronger, honest. It started with small things. Coffee on the porch with Sophie, who no longer looked over her shoulder when Isla entered the room. A shared grocery run where they bumped into half the town, and Isla didn't flinch when someone called her by Naminot, her famous name, but the one that mattered here, Miss Waverly, Clara's granddaughter. Daniel reopened the garage to a steadier stream of customers, most of whom now lingered a little longer just to see if the rumors were true. Where she was back. And this time, she wasn't a story. She was helping unpack shipments and answering phones with that crisp, but now softened tone. The woman in heels had become the woman in worn boots and rolled-up sleeves. But the real change came when Isla quietly began meeting with the town council. No headlines. No cameras. Just Isla, sitting at the end of a folding table, offering ideas. A fund for small business repairs. A proposal for an updated town library. Quiet donations to keep the school's after-care program open. She didn't put her name on anything. She didn't want credit. "It's not about fixing things," she told Daniel one night, as they sat on the steps of Mrs. Delaney's porch, watching Sophie chase fireflies across the yard. "It's about giving people the chance to believe in what's already here." He looked at her, this woman who'd once belonged to boardrooms and billion-dollar brands, now content with muddy shoes and the hum of a small-town spring. "You ever think you'd end up here?" he asked. She smiled, leaning into his shoulder. "I think this is the first time I've ended up anywhere that feels right." And together, they began to build not a fairy tale, not a fix, but something real, something new, something worth staying for. The evening light filtered through the curtains in soft golden stripes, the kind of light that made everything feel safe. Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room rug, a worn puzzle spread out before her. She moved with slow focus, tongue poking out just slightly as she tried to fit two sky-blue pieces together. Isla watched from the armchair, a mug of tea cooling in her hands, a blanket tucked around her legs. The hum of the house, Daniel clinking around in the kitchen, the faint creak of the old radiator made her feel grounded, like she belonged in the spaces between the sounds. "Hey, Isla?" Sophie asked, not looking up. "Yeah, sweetheart?" There was a pause. Sophie's quiet inhale before she spoke again. "Are you going to stay forever?" The question floated gently in the air, innocent and impossibly heavy. Isla set the mug down slowly. Her heart tightened not from fear, but from the deep ache of knowing how much she wanted the answer to be yes. Not for the sake of pretending or running or escaping, but because this, here, now, had become something real, a life, a home. She got up from the chair and knelt beside Sophie, gently smoothing a strand of hair from the girl's cheek. "I hope so," she said softly. "I really do. But are you?" Sophie pressed, looking at her now, wide-eyed and searching. "Are you staying forever?" Isla didn't lie. She never wanted to lie to this girl. "I'm going to stay," she said carefully, "for as long as you'll have me." Sophie seemed to weigh that. Then she smiled small and certain and leaned forward to wrap her arms around Isla's neck. "Good. I think forever's a long time, but we're really good at long things. Isla's throat tightened, and she held Sophie just a little closer, her eyes stinging with the kind of tears she hadn't cried in years. From the kitchen, Daniel paused, listening, his heart catching at the soft laughter and quiet words that floated back to him. Forever had once sounded impossible. Now it just sounded like home. The ribbon wasn't red or fancy. It was a length of weathered rope Daniel had pulled from the back of the shop frayed, sun-bleached, and completely perfect. A small crowd had gathered outside the newly renovated building, bundled in jackets, paper cups of cider in hand. The sign above the entrance gleamed in the early spring sunlight. Hayes, Waverly Auto. The paint was fresh, the lettering clean and simple. No flash. No corporate branding. Just the names of two people who had decided to rebuild something honest, together. Daniel stood beside Isla, her hand quietly resting in his. Sophie bounced beside them, proudly holding the oversized scissors she'd been trusted with for the ceremony. It had taken months of careful planning: new lifts, better tools, enough space for a second bay. They'd hired 2 local high school grads, both eager to learn. A break room had been added, along with a small front office where Isla sometimes worked behind the desk, answering phones with a headset and a smile. But the heart of the shop hadn't changed. There was still an old radio on the shelf, still a faint scent of oil and metal that clung to everything. The walls bore framed photos of Daniel's father, the first Hayes to run a wrench here. And now, beside them, a photo from the winter fair: Sophie, Isla, and Daniel grinning in the snow. "Ready, kiddo?" Daniel asked. Sophie nodded, then carefully snipped the rope in 2. The crowd clapped and cheered, not the kind of cheer you get in a city, but something deeper, familiar, supportive. Daniel looked around at the faces he knew, neighbors, customers, friends who'd come back, one by one, not because he asked, but because they remembered who he was. "Thank you all," he said, voice steady, but rough with emotion. "This place has always been about helping people. And now we've got more hands to help." He glanced at Isla, who gave him a quiet, proud smile. No headlines, no press releases, just a town, a shop, a family, and a sign that said everything that mattered: Hayes. Waverly Auto, a name that didn't erase the past, but honored the future. Snow fell in delicate flurries, soft as breath. Drifting down onto the quiet streets of Cedar Falls like nature had held its breath just for this day. The church wasn't grand, just the small white chapel at the edge of town, with creaky wooden pews and windows that fogged at the bay edges. But inside, it glowed. Candles flickered on every windowsill. Twine-bound pine sprigs adorned the aisle. It smelled like cedar and warmth and something sacred. Daniel stood at the front, his tie slightly crooked. Sophie had insisted on helping him with it that morning. His hands were calm, but his heart thundered in his chest. He scanned the room: friends, neighbors, mechanics, teachers, people who had known him through every version of his life. Every one of them smiling. Then the music started: simple piano, the kind that didn't need lyrics to say what mattered, and when Isla appeared at the end of the aisle, everything else disappeared. She wasn't wearing diamonds. No veil, no designer label stitched into her dress. Just a long-sleeved ivory gown, soft and flowing, a small bouquet of winter greenery cradled in her hands. Her hair was pinned up, a few strands falling loose, and her eyes never left his. She didn't walk like someone used to making an entrance. She walked like someone coming home. Sophie was the first to tear up, sitting in the front pew with her chin in her hands, watching Isla like she was watching a story unfold in real time. Daniel didn't cry until Isla reached the altar and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They didn't read vows off paper. They spoke from the heart. Quietly, simply. "I choose you," she said. "Not because I need saving, not because you fixed something broken, but because with you I am the most honest version of myself." "And I choose you," Daniel replied, his voice thick. "Because, with you, home stopped being a place and started being a person. They sealed it with a kiss as snow fluttered past the stained glass windows. The world outside hushed in reverence. And for the first time, Isla Waverly wasn't defined by a legacy, a company, or a name. She was simply his. And she belonged. The house was quiet in the way only a winter night could make it soft. Still, filled with the hush of snow settling outside and the distant creak of warm wood under gentle heat. The wedding had ended hours ago, but the glow remained, tucked into every corner of the little home Daniel had built, one memory at a time. The three of them sat together on the couch, a blanket tangled across their legs, mugs of leftover cider growing cold on the coffee table. Sophie was nestled between them, pajama-clad and drowsy from a day of excitement, her head resting on Isla's shoulder. Daniel watched them, arms around them both, and felt the kind of peace he never thought he'd earn. Isla laughed softly at something Sophie mumbled in half-sleep, brushing a hand through the girl's hair. Her wedding ring, a simple silver band, glinted faintly in the firelight. "I think this is my favorite part," Isla whispered. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What? The part where the bride wears fuzzy socks and cider gets cold before anyone drinks it?" She smiled and leaned her head against his. "No, the quiet after, when everything feels real." He looked around the fireplace crackling, Sophie snoring softly, the air scented with pine and a hint of cinnamon. This wasn't the life people had expected Isla Waverly to choose. It wasn't what they'd predicted for a girl born into boardrooms and chauffeured cars. But it was hers, and his, and Sophie's. And Daniel realized, not for the first time, that the greatest story he'd ever lived didn't begin with a wedding, or a headline, or even a kiss. It began with groceries, with a neighbor, with an open heart, on an ordinary day. A single act of kindness. He looked down at the two people, leaning against him his daughter, his wife, and understood what the heart remembers most. Not the noise, not the glory, not the weight of the world, but the quiet moments, the unexpected ones, the ones that change everything, not with a bang, but with a choice, to stop, to help, to love, and to stay.